Hello, good evening. Herzlich willkommen. My name is Micha Seidenberg. My name is Micha Seidenberg. I'll continue in English because our guest is English speaking. This is an ICST Artist Talk. ICST is the Institute for Computer, Music and Sound Technology. We organize artist talks and with our residency guests, for instance. And I have the pleasure to welcome Sarah Duffy. Sarah Duffy is a London-based artist. She has graduated in 2013 at Goldsmiths and has a quite impressive number of solo expositions and performances. For instance, the Enjoy the Silence solo performance at the Camden Arts Centre in London. I'm not gonna make the whole list. We had the pleasure to have Sarah Duffy in this summer at ICST for a residency in the spatial audio synthesis residency program. And Sarah Duffy developed a ambisonic piece and will speak today about her artistic practice. Thank you very much. I give you now the word.
Hello everyone, good evening, and thank you so much for being here. I can see a few familiar faces and know a few people have come a long way, so I'm grateful to be here. And I'd like to thank ICST for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as Miha said, I'm an artist based in London. I actually originally come from a visual arts background, so composing is still relatively new for me. But I think in some ways with ambisonics and spatial sound, I found a new medium to work with that allows me to explore both my interest in sound and my interest in sculpture, because it's a kind of sculptural form of sound, which I'll talk more about later, and which you can hear in the presentation as well. So I move across many different mediums in my work, mainly time-based mediums, though I would say, working in live performance, video, and more recently sound. I find that often a kind of idea will come to me first, something I find interesting, a research topic, and then gradually as I sort of work on this idea, the form that it takes as an artwork will emerge. And sometimes that involves learning new skills entirely, including this time ambisonic sound design and composition. So it also brings me to working with people in a number of different areas, from archaeology, history, dance, and music. So it feels like quite an adventure kind of moving through all these different mediums. There are three themes that I see kind of recurring in my work over the years, and they're present, I would say, in the work that I'm going to be showing later, but also in some of the works I'll talk about now. The first theme, which has been ongoing for about 10 years now, is my interest in the human voice. In particular, the kind of immaterial properties of the human voice and its kind of ability to both be part of our body and something separate from our body that leaves our body. It's actually created by no one single organ in our body, and yet it's a hugely physical process that creates the human voice. And then it, of course, departs us and enters into other people's bodies via their ears. And what I also find particularly interesting about the human voice as a medium is that it can be preserved and captured by recording technology, and then it can actually outlive us, it can survive us past our deaths. And it's got something of this, I don't know, the essence of a person that's contained within their voice, all this emotional information. So the second theme I'll talk about is my interest in the transformation of physical spaces and the invisible or near invisible traces that linger or haunt spaces after people leave them. And I'm particularly interested in how people might try to detect this invisible information about a space, from archaeologists to ghost hunters to historians, how they try to interpret what is no longer there, essentially. And the final theme that you'll see throughout my work and my presentation this evening is my interest in magic and illusion. I'm interested in the emotional, psychological effect of a magic trick, but also what goes into creating a magic trick, the stagecraft, the technique. And I like to kind of peek behind the curtain. And sometimes in my work, I allow a kind of look behind this curtain. So that's just an introduction to some of the themes. I'm going to start by talking about one of my first pieces relating to the human voice, actually. This goes back about 10 years, just after I finished my master's. And I got very interested in ventriloquism, which, if you don't know, is the art of speaking or singing without moving your lips. And this traditional practice is now commonly associated with male figures who have a puppet, and they throw their voice onto this puppet and make it appear as if the puppet is speaking. But actually, this is a relatively new development in this practice. And in my research into it, it's more commonly associated with female religious and spiritual figures in the past. And they wouldn't have a puppet. Instead, what they would be doing is conjuring the voices of gods and demons, or sometimes the dead through seance practices. And there's all sorts of examples of these female spiritual figures throughout history and throughout religious texts. And I'm sort of interested in how they use this skill, this kind of sneaky skill, to allow themselves to speak, to empower themselves in a time often when women weren't allowed to speak, but also how they were often conjuring up male voices. And there seems to be a pattern in these stories as well, that these women would often meet a gruesome end or demise. And one such example is of a woman named Elizabeth Barton. She was a famous nun in Tudor England, if you can believe there's such a thing. And she was so famous, in fact, that she was granted a meeting with Henry VIII, the King of England at the time. And during this meeting, she ventriloquized, spoke without moving her lips, the voice of the devil, saying that if Henry was to marry Anne Boleyn and depart from the Catholic Church, there would be a special place in hell for him. And Henry was incredibly disturbed by this. He was really shaken up by this. But she was really famous in her time. It wasn't easy for him to take action. So he spent around about a year discrediting her and blackening her name until the point where he was able to execute her. So he was very threatened by this figure. And so this history really got me thinking, you know. I thought, how amazing that this tool was used, this form of trickery and deception, to gain power, but how tragic and sad that, in a way, it wasn't enough. And I decided I'm going to have to learn ventriloquism. That was the thought that came into my head. And so this is one of those things, like I said before, where I have to find the form, and in this case, the form was to become a ventriloquist. I didn't want to use a puppet because I wanted to hark back to these female religious figures. And I really wanted to kind of present this like sad female figure that was singing these sort of forlorn love songs. And this led to a series of performances in site-specific spaces all over the world, actually, now, from five-star hotel rooms to interrogation chambers to an old office block in Moscow. And I thought I'd just share one of them with you, which was one of my favorite ones. This event was called OM3AM, and it was hosted by Hans-Ulrich Ulbricht as part of a series of events that took place at 3 o'clock in the morning. And this event had a kind of secretive quality to it, in that these invites went out and people were told to meet in this tunnel under the River Thames at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then they witnessed this very strange sight indeed. And I'm going to show you a bit of the documentation for this, which is actually comprised of people's camera phone footage, as we wanted it to have this strange kind of like internet viral quality to it. So the footage would not be kind of classic performance documentation. It would be more this thing that was kind of spread online as this strange phenomenon, a bit like if you encountered this ventriloquist performance in the middle of the night when you were walking home. So I'm just going to show a really short clip from this performance.
I thought that I was all that you thought is true, oh, so true. I love you even more than I did before. The darling, what can I do? Though you don't love me, and I'll always be
So the slightly different thing about this performance as well was it wasn't just one time that this song was sung. It was sung over and over again on repeat until I reached the point of collapse and someone was there to catch me. So it was a kind of attempt as well to show the physical effort of this skill. And I wanted there to be this kind of contrast between, I guess, that effort within my chest and the stillness of the face. And yeah, this kind of illusion versus the reality of what's actually happening to the body in the process. And I also chose this song, this particular song. I don't know if you've seen David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, but in that film, this song, Crying by Roy Orbison, is sung by a woman who collapses midway through the song, and her voice continues without her. So it's a kind of inverse of that performance. So anyway, moving on now. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened after that. So I became very interested in the Greek myth of the sirens. It related a lot to my research into ventriloquism and the idea of women using their voices in perhaps dangerous ways to lure men or deceive men. And this is actually an image from a performance I won't talk much about at the moment, called Song to the Siren, that took place in Germany in 2017. It happened in the water, and it featured me singing Song to the Siren by Tim Butley, and this very kind of atmospheric environment where kind of multiple voices seem to be emerging from me all at once. And over the following year after that, I started to get interested in other versions of this myth or other interpretations, because I realized that there were a lot of similar stories all around the world about women or female ghosts that would lure sailors onto the rocks or lure people into the ocean to a watery end. And I had read about this story in South Korea of the Mulgwishin, who are water ghosts, traditionally female as well, who lure people into the water. And this story, this myth, particularly proliferates around coastal regions that have seen a lot of upheaval and a lot of kind of colonial change of hands. And these ghosts are seen as vengeful ghosts who have suffered and want to drag people into this watery grave with them. So I got the opportunity to go to South Korea on a 3-month residency. And when I was there, I visited 2 islands, each at the opposite end of South Korea, one right on the border with North Korea. And both of these islands, Gangwon in the north and Jeju in the south, play a fundamental role in Korean history. As I said, Gangwon shares this border with North Korea, where I don't know if you've ever heard those stories of North Korea playing propaganda over the water and South Korea playing K-pop back. This is a kind of ongoing thing that happens on Gangwon Island. And so as I was visiting these islands, I was walking around filming, and I got this kind of sense of these water ghosts or these water spirits or something lingering around in those spaces, some trace of the past. And I started to kind of imagine the previous occupants of these islands, which eventually became the basis of this short film I made called The Island. I wanted to create this sense that there was a spectral being perhaps yearning to return to the world, even if it no longer resembles the one that they were part of. And I wanted to sort of look in and reflect on this work, on the mark that each of us makes on the world, and the spaces that we occupy that then change and perhaps are no longer marked on future maps, become kind of unmarked spaces. And so I'm just going to go out of this presentation quickly because I'm just going to play you a short excerpt from this film.
Yours was the first body to wash up on the shore. And you are still there, on the island, in the cold ground, beneath the trees. She asked you not to come back and haunt her. So you didn't, despite her later pleas just to see you one more time. No one says your name anymore. All those who knew you have also lost theirs. Can you even remember yours? How many others now claim the same name? There are many replacements. For you and your body. For the space you once occupied. For the walls that once housed you. They have their own walls now. And their own maps. Maps that are quite different from yours, but describe the same geographical space.
So there you have a short excerpt from that film. It's around about 5 minutes in total, and it's been screened in exhibition contexts and also at screening events. I'm just going to head back to the presentation now. So this is a presentation of the work at the Korean Cultural Centre in London. And now, moving on to a year later, and after I came back from Colombia, I really wanted to focus more on sound. I realised that it was growing as part of my practice, and I wanted to understand the technical side of working with sound more. And so I took a short course in field recording and soundscape composition at Goldsmiths University. And on this course, I was introduced to many different types of recorders and microphones, including some specialist recording equipment such as infrasonic microphones, which record outside of the audible range and transpose that back into the audible range so you can hear it in real time. They're most commonly used as bat detectors. And also other microphones such as electromagnetic microphones that pick up electronic noise, and hydrophones which can record in water. And I also learned about the process of editing digital audio in this course and about compositional techniques. And I was able to experiment as well with multi-channel editing on more than 2 speakers and introduced to ambisonics and spatial sound, which is what I'm now working in today and which I will talk a little bit more about later. So this led me to propose a sound-based project to Gasworks, a London-based organisation, for a 2-month residency at Lugar Dudas in Cali, Colombia. And when I went there, I was intrigued by how I might be able to capture some special quality or characteristic of a place purely through sound. And I was interested in what field recording could reveal really about a place and a different form of representation of a place to the visual. There's something in the process of analog recording of sound the process of analog recording of sound waves to a layered digital composition that really appeals to me. It feels like another way to map out or represent space. However, when I actually got to Colombia, I realized the limitations in my ability to do this. There are so many layers of history there, and it's so complex in a way. And I was very much aware of my privilege as an artist in this environment, which left me feeling quite immobilized. But one day, I was sort of on one of my field recording adventures, walking around, and I came across this park, and there was this huge ancient tree, which I'll show you here, that was right next to an electricity power plant. And there was this very strange scenario happening there where there was this humming of electricity, and the birds in the trees were replicating this humming sound. And it was kind of haunting and beautiful and quite an absurd situation to find myself in. So I kept recording there, and I kept returning to this place, which I felt was almost a kind of sacred spot in the end. And I started recording this hum, and then I started adding my own voice to this hum to create harmonies with these sounds that I kind of saw as coming from the ether somehow. And this became the backbone of my final performance when I was in Colombia at Lugar Dudas, which was called Receptor. And this took place on my penultimate day in Cali. Despite not originally kind of intending to perform, I wanted to present a sound piece originally. I decided that I had to kind of use my body as some kind of conduit or receptor for this composition to kind of travel through. So here's an image from that performance, and now I'm again just going to show you a very quick excerpt. So, moving on from this, on my return, I realized that I really wanted to delve deeper into these ideas somehow, and that I wanted to tap into this hidden information in our world, access it somehow. I felt frustrated by the boundaries of representation, but I was intrigued by how the human body could be this receptor or this conduit somehow that could receive this hidden information and push it out into the world as something else. I was imagining almost the body being like a radio or a telephone receiver that converts one signal into another. And this also reminded me of the role of the spirit medium and took me back to some of the ideas I was looking into when I was researching ventriloquists, as the spirit medium would channel the voices of the dead. And somehow in the early 20th century, technology kind of took over the role of the medium in some ways. In the early days of photography, for example, mistakes in photographic images were often understood as some kind of communication from a ghostly presence. And there are many examples of this in early photography. And there are a lot of kind of supernatural stories that emerge around new technologies, perhaps because people don't, as of yet, know how they work. And so this kind of mystery of how the thing works induces these myths and these legends and this supernatural thinking. And one thing that interested me a lot was ghost hunters who use all this scientific equipment, such as electromagnetic readers, in a way that's really unconventional and strange. They interpret certain feedback in these machines as messages from ghosts. And they're kind of making these claims about technology. And I've always been interested in the idea of technology as a medium between the living and the dead. And it's also quite a popular trope in horror movies, such as Ringu, the Japanese film from the 1990s, which is about a videotape that's haunted and sends this kind of viral message of destruction around with it. So glitches and mistakes in technology are often interpreted as signs of something from the other side. But what is this so-called other side they speak of? Is it just all information about our universe that we can't access because we're limited by our own human perception, the world that exists beyond the veil? So I wanted to get beyond traditional limitations of representing space and create a kind of alternative form of mapping. I'm personally quite open-minded about the presence of spirits in our world, but I mean, I'm very agnostic about it. But when I talk about the idea of haunting and traces, I'm more talking about it in a metaphorical sense. The idea that the past is somehow imprinted upon the present, and that there are traces of it everywhere. I'm always interested in what remains of the past and how we can detect it. This is why I'm also so interested in folklore and ghost stories. These unreliable oral histories give us a direct link to those that inhabited the world before us. And this goes full circle for me as well, as I mentioned earlier that ghost hunters often use faults in electromagnetic frequency readers to prove the existence of spirits. And there's a significant amount of pseudoscience related to the presence of spirits and the electromagnetic spectrum. One thing that I found kind of interesting about this is that whether it's ghost hunters with their EMF detectors, artists and musicians with their field recording devices, or even geophysicists sending electromagnetic waves into the ground, all of these people are trying to tap in some way to some invisible, unseen information and bring it into the visible, audible world. So this brings me on to this project. In 2021, I got the opportunity to go on a residency to an old fortress in Ireland, very close to the border with Northern Ireland. And this fortress was built in Napoleonic times. And I wanted to learn more about the history of this fort, called Fort Dunree, and the Inishowen Peninsula in general. So I ended up collaborating with the local history society there. And a member of the history society called John McCarran introduced me to some archaeologists that he'd been working with. There was a field right next to Fort Dunree that someone had a hunch about was once a very important monastic site in Ireland. And this kind of came from folklore and stories that have been told about this place. And so these geophysicists and archaeologists came to the space and they did an electromagnetic survey of the site. And they basically sort of put these electromagnetic instruments along the ground And through this process, they were able to image the subsurface, and they were able to find that this had indeed been a monastic site, perhaps one of the most important in Ireland, but had yet to be discovered, essentially. And so they're still in the process now of trying to organise a dig of this site. But so far, they've discovered various aspects of the site that prove that it was a very significant site, and that also it was likely invaded by the Vikings and burnt down at some point. So it has this quite violent history to it. And so during this process, I was able to talk to these archaeologists and obtain the electromagnetic data. And then through this process called data sonification, I was able to take that data and map it to pictures and notes, and be able to turn this into a piece of music, into a piece of, I guess, my first spatial music, a piece of music that represented the site. So it's quite a long process of interpreting this data. And it wasn't until I got to Ireland on the residency that I was really able to find the correct kind of timbre for the notes that I received from the data. Like, I needed to get some information about the site, some visual information, some kind of feeling from the site in order to create this piece of music. And over the course of several weeks, I was able to eventually bring this piece of music together. And then I hosted a walking tour. So we walked from the fortress to a viewing platform just above this field, and people were able to listen to this piece of music in situ. And then a year later, this is actually an image of the field, so you can kind of see from above that there are some strange kind of variations in the ground, and this is representative of what's beneath the surface of the ground. This is from the walk, and one of the visitors to the walk listening to the piece. And a year after this walk, I was invited to come back and sort of make this project more permanent. So we worked with the designer to create a map which people could pick up at the fortress, which is a popular tourist site in the area. And then at the fortress, they can download the music and then take their own walking tour to the viewing listening point and listen to it in situ. So I'm just going to actually play you a short clip from this piece. And I think as you listen to it, I hope you feel some kind of sense of the place. The data represents the way in which the instrument moved over the field. And also, the data was taken at two depths, at the depth of 5 meters and at the depth of 10 meters, which actually helped me with the musical composition element of this piece, as it allowed me to kind of add depth and layers to the music. So I'll play you a very short clip from that now. So also when I was at Fort Dunray, I spent a lot of time wandering around underground bunkers that had been left relatively unscathed and untouched, and were very eerie and really did have quite a haunted presence about them. And I kept coming across strange scenes in these weird army bunkers. One that really resonated with me was walking into this underground bunker and there just being a pack of playing cards that was just strewn all across the floor. And it looked like, some strange game or card game had taken place maybe just hours before. And it really kind of moved me in some strange way. So from this experience, I ended up creating a performance. As I'm sure it's clear now, I'm very interested in sight and site-specific performance. And this performance took place on the burnt-down ruins of an old officers' mess, which was basically the social club of officers at Fort Dunray, where they would have played card games, where they would have passed their time. And this is quite a peculiar performance in that it doesn't actually feature my voice. It's more a kind of dance or choreography of strange movements with playing cards and a mirror. And I was interested in the mirror because mirrors are often used in the act of summoning or in seances as a way of kind of drawing the spirits in. But with this performance, I wanted people to be left with a kind of uncertainty over whether they were watching a summoning or something supernatural or a kind of magic trick, thinking about the playing cards and mirrors and magic, or whether it was more a kind of gambling with some unseen opponent. And the piece is called The House Always Wins, which refers to the gambling term. But also in my mind, I was thinking about this term in terms of the fact that it seems to have a sense or convey some sense that time always somehow wins and that places continue to exist without us once we're gone. And there are quite a few different versions of this work. There's a live performance version, there's a photo series, and there's also a performance film. And with many of my performances and my pieces of work, I make different versions of them or variations of them, which all have different characteristics depending on the medium and the form that I use. And this is relevant to the piece of work I'm showing tonight, that I'm showing for the first time in its first version or variation. And I actually don't want to give away too much of the tricks of this piece, but I do want to talk a little bit about what triggered it in my mind, and also about spatial sound in general and the technology and perhaps the future of this technology. So during the pandemic, I was reading an article, as you do, about a ghost story, an urban legend from the 90s. Basically a kind of viral story or tale that was spread, that if you called this specific number, you would hear this strange robotic voice repeating these kind of weird poetic sentences. Here are some examples of them. He carved a head from a round block of marble, shut the hatch before the waves crash in. The crooked maze failed to fool the mouse. And so people would ring this number, they'd hear these robotic sentences and assume, as I said before, about people's kind of curiosity and fear around technology, that this was some message from the other side. But actually, the truth of this story was far more weird than even that. So in the 1940s, there was a secret psychoacoustic laboratory that was set up at Harvard University. And they were tasked with the mission of developing acoustic military technology and basically testing the audio fidelity of this technology. And so they needed to come up with a series of sentences that were highly phonetically balanced. The reason they had to be highly phonetically balanced was that they needed to be able to be misheard as something else in order to tell whether they were coming through correctly in audio technology. So for example, if you're a fighter pilot, you want a clear message. So you want to make sure that the real sentence is coming through and people aren't misinterpreting that sentence. And so these sentences played quite a large role in the development of audio technology and in the Second World War. And they had this kind of, they're sort of unknown by the general public. But strangely, after the war, they became the standard for acoustic testing all over the world. And so they're still used to this day, from anything from cochlear implants to telephone engineers. And so the reality of this ghost story was that the number was actually a test line for telephone engineers checking to see if telephone lines were working correctly. But somehow it got misinterpreted and became this quite captivating ghost story. And these sentences really resonated with me. There's something about them that's mysterious and poetic. Each seems to be a miniature vignette or story. There are 720 of them altogether, so part of my process of creating this work was to really fine-tune that and find the sentences that really resonated or had some kind of musical quality. Strangely, a lot of these sentences feel quite violent or threatening in some way, which may relate to the context in which they were created, but also there's a kind of hint of Americana about them, or something of the 1940s or 1950s even, that makes them kind of a little bit cinematic at times. And so the other thing that kind of really struck me about them was that they remind me a little bit of sort of code language, and they seem like there could be something more to them, like they could be a kind of cipher or something. And so all of these kind of ideas came into my mind about the sentences. And the piece you'll hear tonight is called The Harvard Sentences, and I don't want to reveal too much more about it, but I really wanted to tell you that story because I think it's a fascinating one, and again, an untold history, or a little-known history, which is something that I really enjoy exploring in my work. So I want to move on a little bit and talk about ambisonics again and immersive sound. Around about the same time that I discovered these sentences, I was developing a growing interest in spatial sound and ambisonics, and in particular how to use it in combination with the human voice in some way to kind of make the human voice sculptural or more solid, to give it this kind of holographic quality, and to kind of shift it around and move it in space. And this really, again, relates back to the ventriloquism, because I was thinking of it as a form of ventriloquism, as a way of literally throwing voices around space, moving those voices in all directions. And it's really quite a strange experience, spatial sound. I'm not sure how many of you will have ever attended a spatial sound event before, because there's still a lot of work developing in this area and infrastructure being built to kind of make spatial sound happen more frequently and for people to experience it more. But spatial sound, ambisonics in particular, creates a sound field which feels like you're almost stepping into a scene or into a kind of acoustic hologram, as I mentioned before. And it makes sound feel very tangible and real and heavy, and like you can kind of feel the objects around you. And it's an acoustic illusion based on psychoacoustic principles, but it really does have this capacity to kind of get into your body and feel real somehow. So I decided I wanted to experiment with the Harvard sentences in ambisonics. And as I said, I saw it as a kind of continuation of my work in ventriloquism. Only, this way, as I said, I could throw my voice or other people's voice around vast spaces. And so I got some funding which allowed me to spend several months training in ambisonics to learn the skills and the technique. And then I set up my own mini spatial sound studio at the place I live in London. I live at an artist residency which has some little outhouses, so I set up a studio there. And I started kind of working on this and using the Harvard sentences as my guide to create a work. And as I kind of moved on in the process, the development of my skills and the refinement of my skills really allowed me to refine the illusions that I was able to create, and also the kind of the conceptual basis of the work that I was making. It also kind of cultivated more of a musical sensibility in me, because it forced me to really listen to the world in a very different way in order to be able to create this three-dimensional effect myself in sound. So in the summer, I was given the opportunity to do a residency in ambisonics at ICST, which I was delighted with, and it was enormously helpful, as ICST are world specialists in spatial sound and ambisonics. And they've in fact developed some of the software and plugins for digital audio workspaces, which are used all around the world and are highly regarded. So I got the opportunity to work for 2 weeks in their composition studio and really start to refine this piece of work that I've been building and working on for so long, and have, you know, fabulous mentors such as Johanna Schutt, who's here tonight, to really kind of guide my ear and help develop this practice. Today, you're going to hear the first ever public presentation of this work. It is a very exciting experience for me. When I first started making this work, my idea was that it would be accompanied by a visual installation. And I'm still very interested in making this version of the piece, which I'll talk about in a moment. But also, as I've developed in the medium, I've realized that it does have a quality that kind of speaks for itself. Like, it has a quality as a medium. But going back to this idea of versions earlier on, I see that there could be many different versions of this work. It could be played in a concert hall like this, on 28 speakers, which is wonderful that we have this opportunity. It could be made as a binaural mix that could be listened to as a kind of unique release online, or it could function in an art installation. And I've had an idea for some time around this installation. I would like to have this piece running on a loop in a gallery space. And the idea is that the audience would walk in and they would see this circular curtain open in front of them. This curtain would be made of a translucent fabric. And once they enter this circle, they'd sit down on chairs facing outwards in a kind of seance, or an inverse of a seance circle, and then this curtain would close around them. Then the piece would start, and the piece would be accompanied by very subtle lighting that would be activated by the energy field of the sound, which I'll explain more in a moment, that would just kind of flicker on the outside of this curtain. And this curtain is made from a sort of semi-translucent material that when the light hits it in a certain way, it's opaque, and other times it's translucent. So it's something that wouldn't affect visually, it wouldn't overstimulate them visually so much that it would kind of disregard the sound. It would kind of accompany the sound and the overall listening experience. And then the idea is, after the piece finishes, this curtain would open and they would go on their way, and this would run on a loop and it would continue. And part of my interest in presenting it in this way is that, as someone who comes from a performance background, I'm very interested in performance documentation and how we bring performance into gallery spaces. And, you know, as you've seen in my work, I make photo series of my performance, I make video works of my performance. But with spatial sound, you could actually have the possibility of recording a performance in 3D and then playing it back in a gallery. So it kind of brings aliveness to a gallery experience without a performer having to be there, which I think is an incredible thing. I spoke to you before about the energy field of the sound. So this is the way that the sound is actually moving around space in terms of the actual sound pressure. So this can be linked to lighting and basically create a kind of visual pattern of lighting based on the energy field of sound. So I'll just play you a little clip of this, because I think it's fascinating the way that sound moves around in ambisonics. And it's interesting to visualize it in some way, and I'm quite although, as I said, I feel like the sound kind of does something on its own, I'm also interested in various kind of visual representations of it.
List 11. The pipe began to rust while new. The hog crawled under the high fence. List
Giving
12.
you too much of a sneak preview there. This is just a reference image, an example. This isn't from my work, but from a theatrical performance. Kind of imagining this sort of curtain. This curtain is actually the same material that I would like to use in this installation eventually. And again, a visual representation of that curtain kind of opening. So this enclosed space that really makes people feel like they're having this performative experience within a gallery space. And then that moves me on, really, to my final point, which is about the future of ambisonics as I see it. There are currently ambisonic microphones in development. This one is called a Zelia mic, and it can record the ambience of spaces or real-life events in spaces. And I'm kind of interested in how this might become the recording technology of the future. It produces a file called a B format, which is also used in ambisonics, but I won't go too much into the technical at this point. And although it's maybe a dream at the moment and doesn't have the capacity quite to do this yet, I was thinking about how maybe there could be kind of memory recordings created of spaces, you know, three-dimensional recordings that can be replayed back in the future. I mean, we don't know what the future playback systems will be, but it's interesting to think of, for example, music played for vinyl that's now been transformed into digital, and how we kind of interpret recordings made in the past in the future. And I kind of had this idea or this vision in a way of perhaps how we can create recordings of ourselves that can be played back after death and conjure up our own spectral form. And this kind of slightly romanticized idea, I guess, goes or harks back to the beginning of recording technology, when it was actually mainly used to record the voices of dying loved ones, so that it could be played back after their death. So actually, the history of recording technology is very much linked to grief and loss. And it was, you know, these recordings were kind of memento mori. So I was imagining what this memento mori might be in spatial sound. And again, this brings me back to the human voice, because there is a sense of loss to the human voice. It's always leaving us. It's always leaving our bodies. And once it's gone, it's forever exited. And it's departed from us. I'm also curious to see how ambisonics might develop in other ways, outside of music, outside of art. How it might be, for example, used in therapeutic contexts, perhaps to help in situations of grief. It's very hard to actually imagine what the full scope of its usage actually is, because there's so many new developments in it and it's happening so quickly. Who knows for what purposes it will actually be used in the future. But in my practice now, you know, I really feel like I've found a medium that I can get my teeth into and that I've put a lot of effort into and time, over 2 years now of work on really getting the technical details of it right. And I feel like it really, as a kind of call to action, I feel like it needs, you know, composers and artists working in this medium, and also the infrastructure for this work to be played and to take place. For settings like this, I mean, this is an extremely high-level setting to hear ambisonics in, but it can be adapted to different numbers of speakers and different spaces and conditions. So I feel that this is really a medium that's going to be incredibly important in our future, because it's so visceral and immersive, and it can actually also take place without the use of a headset, like a VR headset or headphones. It's something that you can experience as an illusion, as a magic trick. And so I feel excited about sharing this first piece with you, and of you experiencing on such a great system. And I hope you can stay for the presentation at 8 o'clock. We're now going to move into a Q&A session. But yes, just to let you know, the Q&A session will be about half an hour. And then we'll have a break, and then the first session will happen at 8, and the piece is 17 minutes long. If you can, I recommend you sit as close to the centre of the room as possible, because that's called the sweet spot and the place in which the psychoacoustic illusion is at its best. There will be 3 slots to hear the sound as well, so if you want to go away and come back at a later point, you're welcome to do so. So thank you. I'll hand over to Miha now.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So I don't think I have much more to add right now. As you said, the installation will be shown at 8 o'clock and 8:30 and 9 o'clock. And now, if some of you have questions, I can hand you over the microphone. Is there a question?
I'm very happy to answer questions, either now or afterwards, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. But I would love some questions.
Well, I would have one. I was just wondering, so this a fascination for the voice is that's a really interesting story in your artistic practice, and you kind of went into it through ventral, I can't even say it in English, it's Bauchreden in German,
Ventriloquism.
Thank you.
But actually that's, I believe, just Latin for belly speaking. So
Exactly,
yeah.
Belly, yeah. And, well, if this is performed, it's a very impressive thing also because there's a person, and so there's the presence of the person and the presence of the voice, which is also a very personal thing, and the weird thing is that there's the voice, but it's not really connected to the chest or to the mouth chester, let's say, which is in our perception a very important thing when it comes to music perception. Also, when we hear a cello sound, we kind of project the idea of a chester that this person who is playing the cello is doing. And I was just wondering, when you do ambisonics piece with the voice, then you kind of lose the presence of the person. So I was wondering if you were also thinking of bringing those elements together, the body presence, let's say, and the disembodied voice in a certain way.
Yes, certainly, that's a good question. I'm very interested in the disembodied voice and various theories that have been posited around the disembodied voice and recording technology, how the separation of voice and body produces quite uncanny sensations in people. And this is something as well with this idea of having a performance without a performer present that I'm interested in, the voice without the performer present. But there's also another version that I envision of this piece, which uses the same setup as the gallery piece. My idea would be that the gallery piece would run on a loop, and then occasionally there would be a live performance version, which would feature me walking around beyond the curtain so that I can kind of just be seen by the audience as a shadowy figure. And then my real voice would be added to this performance, and it would become kind of unclear and disorientating what was the 3D effect, what was the ambisonics, and what was the real voice. I can also automate my voice to move in certain ways, so I can kind of preset it to move in similar ways to the ambisonic piece. So there's a lot of potential there as well to add performative elements to ambisonic work and to really kind of play with this uncanny disassociation between voice and body.
Thank you. Well, I don't think we have to have question absolutely, but also thank you so much for this presentation. I think you did it so well, so we don't have any more to ask.
Well, that's nice.
And so I would love to see you at 8 o'clock or in one of the following sessions. That would be really great. And otherwise, we will close now this artist talk.
Yes, thank you very much for attending. I've really enjoyed being here, and I really hope you come for one of the presentations later, as I'm very, very excited to share this piece. So thank you, everyone.